Hello everyone and welcome to the fifth video as a part of the training videos on filling up and submitting the DGQI second edition self-assessment questionnaire via the DGQI portal. In this series, we are explaining how the ministry departments can answer each and every section and each and every question of the questionnaire via the DGQI portal, and this is the fifth video in the series. In this series, we'll give you a walkthrough of how to answer the questions in Part A, Section D, which is data management. We go to the Add Part A button and we look at the Section D, data management within Part A. Before we move to the questions, the initial two themes were on data strategy pillar. Data management pillar is a part of the data systems pillar, and the theme has the questions here basically assess how data management is undertaken by the ministries at the ministerial level. So there are 5 sections which are to be answered in this section. The first section asks whether there are data management guidelines or a general architecture in place, and it is documented by the ministry that explains how is data generated, processed, stored, exchanged, archived, and destroyed, and all these processes. So it basically explains and lays down guidelines for how data is to be managed across its life cycle, and it lays down these standards for all the divisions across the ministry for them to follow. So if the ministry has these guidelines in place, then they can select yes. And if it selects yes, they have to explain what has been the scope of these guidelines and how are they being implementing. If it is no, then they can select no. If the answer to the previous question is no, then the next question is not to be answered and it will get automatically disabled. If the answer to the first question is yes, that is, there are these guidelines, then the next question asks if there is a dedicated senior level officer who is responsible to check the compliance of these data management processes. So essentially, if there is an officer who is checking whether the different divisions of the ministry are collecting and exchanging and so on and so forth, managing data as per these guidelines, and this is being done on a regular basis or not. So if there is such an officer, then it will accordingly be yes, otherwise it will be no. So there is no cap on the number of officers. It can be 1 or 2 or more number of officers. Then we have the next question on whether data ownership norms are clearly defined. So data ownership norms are important so that whenever data is being shared with any other ministries or any other parties, or it is being generally released in public, it is very important to know who is the owner of this data, so that the source of the or the origin can be sourced. So therefore, the ministries can answer yes or no depending on whether they have clearly defined and documented these norms or not. The next question is on whether there is a framework for assessing the risk and the value of the data that is collected by the ministry. So whenever any ministry or any entity collects, any data, there is some value attached to it, which is basically from its utility perspectives, how it will help in decision making or how it will facilitate in any other monitoring or administrative activity. That is the value of the data that is being collected. On the other hand, there is also some associated risk, which is associated with this data. These may be data security related risk. This may be data privacy related risk for personal data. So it is important to ensure the balance between the two, so that we are collecting all important type of data also, but we are also managing risk, so that we are not collecting very sensitive data that may be very risky to manage later on. So therefore, it is important to maintain the risk, and there should be a framework that should be adopted to manage this risk and to assess this risk and vis-a-vis the value, as done by several other entities in private and public domain. So if the ministry is doing this and has such a framework, then it can select yes and explain how is this done. If no, the ministries can select no. Finally, the fifth question asks about data ethics. So this is basically about whether there is a framework on ethical use of data in the ministry or not, and if it is well documented. So data ethics basically means defining the concepts of right and wrong conduct in relation to the data. So whenever ministry collects any data, be it personal or non-personal, has it clearly defined what kind of uses it can be used for, what kind of uses can it not be used for, and this has been directly communicated to the people whose data this is. And especially with respect to personal data, but this is data ethics also cover non-personal data also, that it should not be used for any unintended purposes for which it was not collected. So ensuring that there is a framework governing this use, it has been clearly documented or not, that's the question. And if there is this framework documentation, then the ministries can select yes, otherwise it is no. And just to highlight, especially with the use of new technologies such as machine learning and predictive algorithms, it has become even more important to protect this data and ensure ethical use of data, because with the use of these technologies, it is easier to de-anonymize data now. So therefore, especially if the ministries are using such technologies, it is suggested that the framework covers how these technologies are to be also used by the ministry. But it does not mean that only those, that the question is only relevant for those ministries which are using these technologies. So the question is universally applicable, but what we are saying here is that if the ministry is using some technologies also, then it should also be a part of this framework. So accordingly, the ministries can select yes or no depending on whether they have this exhaustive framework governing the ethical use, including use of possible technologies. And if they don't have such framework, then they have to write down no, select no. And if yes, they can explain how is this done. So these are the 5 questions under data management at the ministerial level. There is a similar section at the part B level also, but that section will have to be answered at the scheme level. These are the questions related to data management which are important to be undertaken at the ministry level, because these frameworks, these norms have to be common across the ministry and they are not scheme specific. Therefore, this section has been kept at the ministry level, and some questions on this section have been kept at the scheme level, just to clarify the difference between part A and part B, so that it does not result in any confusion when the ministries are filling up this section here. So that's all in part A, section D. In the next video, we'll be covering part A, section E. Thank you.